In the winter of 1793, the earth in Exeter, Rhode Island, turned black and heavy like soaked wool. Snow fell with a silence too dense to be natural. People in the surrounding hamlets began to speak in whispers, not from reverence but from dread, the kind of dread that presses against the ribs, slow and cold, like the memory of a scream long forgotten but never silenced. For in that winter, the dead would not stay buried. The living were beginning to vanish, one by one, as if being slowly devoured by something not of this world. It began with young Edwin Brown. He coughed blood into a rag so often it became a ritual. He'd fold it carefully each morning, as though he believed childishly that, if he treated it with enough respect, the disease would take pity on him. But there is no pity in the hunger of the grave. By the time the town physician came to see him, Edwin's cheeks were hollow, and his eyes no longer followed the movement of the sun. What the doctor saw was not new. It had happened before, many times, in many New England towns. They called it consumption. It took from the lungs, yes, but more than that, took from the spirit. The afflicted began to resemble something already mourned. But Edwin's family knew something more. His sister, Mercy, had died a year prior of the same wasting illness. But Mercy had never really left, or so said the neighbors, who claimed to see her shape at the edge of the Brown family's farmland, cloaked in fog, her eyes gleaming with a hunger that did not belong to the living. At first, her father, George Brown, refused to believe such a village nonsense. He was a God-fearing man, hard-set and rational. But when his second daughter, Mary Olive, began to waste away in the same manner, and then Edwin soon after, the whispers became unbearable. And perhaps worse, they began to make sense. It was not the Lord's punishment, they said. It was not just disease. It was a vampire, but not the kind with capes or fangs, no. Not the dramatic beasts of Gothic stories whispered overseas. The American vampire was quieter, colder. It fed on its own bloodline, tethered to its kin like a parasite to its host. It did not rise from the grave with claw and howl. It drew breath through others from the other side of the soil. George Brown was a man crumbling beneath impossible grief. But even grief can be molded by fear. The villagers approached him with stories not new but ancient, murmured in tones of superstition that had followed their ancestors across the Atlantic. "If one of the dead still walks," said old Silas Abner, whose eyes had not known rest in weeks, "you'll need to dig." George, sleepless and hollowed by loss, consented not out of belief, but desperation, and on March 17, 1892, they gathered at the Chestnut Hill Cemetery with spades in hand. It was bitterly cold, the kind of cold that stiffens thought and bends reality. The earth groaned as they unearthed the bodies of Mary Olive and the mother, Mary Elisa. The corpses were skeletal, as expected, but then they came to Mercy. She was buried in a stone crypt above the frozen ground, and her corpse had not decayed. Her face, they said, looked pink. There was blood in her heart. They said it was proof. The body was burned on a pyre, her heart and liver torn from her chest and turned to ash. The ashes were mixed with water and fed to Edwin as a tonic to cure himby, because that was the ritual. That was what was done when death had made a nest within the family. They believed that drinking the ashes of the vampire would exorcise its grip. But Edwin died 2 months later, screaming into nothingness. And though history would call it superstition, and science would name it tuberculosis, the people of Exeter did not forget. Nor did they sleep. Not really, because even after the flames, they claimed they could still hear the sound of a girl's bare feet pacing the woods, as though the earth had failed to satisfy her hunger, as though they had burned the wrong heart. The smoke had long since faded into the trees, but the story did not die. It lingered in Exeter like a scent, clinging to the bone rafters of every cabin, slipping between floorboards, curled at the base of every cradle. There was no forgetting the morning they burned Mercy Brown's heart. Even those who had held the torch remembered not the heat, but the sound, how it crackled like a voice too old to speak, how the flames moved unnaturally fast, as if eager to consume. But the worst of it wasn't what they saw, it was what they felt. A sense, deep and ancestral, that they had committed not a ritual, but a betrayal. It is easy now to mock them, to paint them as hysterics in homespun wool and religious dread, but such mockery forgets one truth. They were watching their children die, slowly, horribly, one after another, as though an invisible hand was plucking the light from their bloodlines. It was not death that frightened them, it was death that refused to end. That lingered, that fed, and Mercy was not the first. Long before the fires of Exeter, other towns had felt the same chill. In Willington, Connecticut, in 1854, they exhumed the corpse of Lemuel Packer, whose family had wasted away in sequential agony. His heart was cut and buried at a crossroads, nailed beneath a rock. In Jewett City, 1850s, the Ray family unearthed the bodies of two brothers who had died years apart, but whose living kin began coughing blood the same spring. The villagers burned their bones at midnight. The fire kept low so as not to draw attention. It spread like rot beneath floorboards, quiet, persistent, uncontainable. Over 30 documented cases, each one more chilling than the last, and none of them had ever spoken to one another. No letters exchanged, no newspapers detailing the rituals. And yet, they all did the same thing: dig, cut, burn, consume. How did they all know? What darkness passed from throat to throat, silently, with the efficiency of plague? The truth, perhaps, lies not in superstition but in something deeper, older than belief. Call it instinct, call it folklore soaked into the marrow. The idea that not all of the dead go willingly, that sometimes even death can be too weak to hold what it has taken. And so they did what they felt they must. Wives sharpened shovels. Sons stood vigil over the bodies of their mothers. Fathers wept in fields while deciding which grave to open first. These were not people drunk on legend. They were desperate animals, cornered by grief, told by silence that no salvation would come from God or doctor. But even among the devout, doubt festered. Reverend Elias Green, of nearby South Kingston, had preached for 30 years against the heresies of old country superstition. He'd called the tailies of revenant sickness the devil's distraction, a seduction of ignorance. But in 1888, after burying his fourth daughter in 5 winters, he stopped preaching. For 3 weeks, he walked the woods alone, refusing food, refusing company. When he returned, they said he looked ... different, that his eyes no longer held the clarity of daylight, only the flicker of something darker. He said nothing of what he'd seen. But the very next day, he helped exhume the body of his niece. They burned her heart, just like the others. He held it in his hands, did not tremble, did not speak, only watched as it turned to cinder. People began to change after that, not out of fear, but routine. They no longer questioned the rituals. They accepted them as one accepts storms or famine. If a child coughed more than a week, eyes turned toward the graveyard. If 2 in a family died, the third was watched for shadows beneath their skin. The hunger of the grave was no longer a mystery, it was a neighbor. And yet, the more they burned, the colder it grew. It was as if the earth itself resented the flames, as if the wind, which once howled freely, now whispered in a language no one dared translate. They had awoken something that did not forgive, something that watched, because there are parts of the world that do not want to forget the dead, and there are parts of the dead that do not want to be forgotten. By the winter of 1892, Mercy Brown had been dead for 2 months. The frost lay thick over the fields of Exeter, and yet, inside the Brown farmhouse, the air was damp with rot. Edwin Brown, Mercy's only surviving sibling, had returned from Colorado just weeks prior. He had gone west in a desperate bid to find air pure enough to restore his failing lungs. But now he sat in his childhood home wrapped in shawls, coughing blood into a cloth his mother had sewn before her death. His eyes had sunk, his skin turned waxy and yellowed, and he spoke only in whispers, as though each word cost a piece of his soul. His father, George Brown, had buried 3 family members already: Mary, the mother; Mary, Olive, the eldest daughter; and now Mercy. Mercy had died last suddenly, without fever, without time for the slow wasting that claimed the others. It was not supposed to be her. She had been strong, too strong to fall like the rest. And yet there she was, beneath the frozen ground, silent, while Edwin withered in plain sight. Neighbors began to speak again. They said the sickness was not of the lungs, but of the grave, that one of the dead was feeding on the living, and they pointed to the last to die there, one whose body lay too fresh in memory, too sudden in silence. George Brown was no fool. He was a church-going man, educated, with little patience for talk of curses and blood rites. But grief is its own religion. It prays in secret. It makes idols out of desperation. And on the morning of March 17, 1892, George Brown led a group of men, farmers, and the town's doctor into the cemetery through snow-crusted grass to the Brown family plot. They dug 3 graves. Mary, the mother, had long since turned to bone. Mary Olive, too, was decayed and still. But when they reached Mercy's coffin sealed in a stone crypt, above ground, protected from the thaw, what they found changed the town forever. Her body lay untouched. Her hair had grown longer. Her nails were sharper. Her cheeks flushed pink with color. Blood still lingered in her heart and liver, pooled unnaturally, as if pumped by an unseen engine. To those present, it was not death they sued, it was dormancy. The doctor mumbled something about refrigeration, about preservation from the cold, but no one heard him. They were listening to the wind, which had gone utterly silent. They removed her heart, placed it on a flat rock, burned it to ash, and then they mixed those ashes into water and made Edwin drink. It was a ritual older than science, older than faith. The idea that if the living consumed the fire-cleansed remains of the vampire, they could sever the link, undo the bond, break the cycle. Edwin drank. He winced, and he died 2 months later. But it didn't matter. They had done it. And in their eyes, it worked. After Edwin's death, the sickness faded. No one else fell ill. No more blood was coughed into linen. No more funerals in the Brown house. The village, starved of death, began to breathe again. Whether it was medicine or mercy or the ending of a plague, no one could say, but the panic passed, or at least they thought it did, because something shifted in Exeter. Slowly, cattle wandered farther from their pens. Dogs refused to approach the cemetery. Children spoke of a woman in white, standing by the edge of the trees at dusk, pale, barefoot, with red around her lips. The wind returned, but it no longer whispered. It moaned, and dreams, or the dreams. Whole families woke, screaming, claimed they'd seen Mercy standing over them in the night, eyes open, mouth full of smoke. Some said they could still smell the ash on her breath. Others claimed their windows opened by themselves at 3 a.m., letting in frost so sharp it bit the skin. But no one dared speak aloud what they feared most. That burning her heart had destroyed her. It had awakened her, because they forgot the most important rule. You can desecrate the dead, but you cannot control what wakes up. They called her the last vampire of New England, a legend, an anomaly, an echo of old-world horror. But legends are like seeds. Bury them deep enough, and they bloom in places you never expect. And as the years passed, Mercy's grave became more than a tomb. It became a warning. The warning was ignored, not out of disbelief, but out of exhaustion. In 1893, another family near Exeter faced the same slow decay, the same coughing blood, the same dread that clawed at their hearts. The Johnsons had buried their youngest child, Abigail, and soon after, the rest of the family began to wither under a shadow they could neither name nor fight. In desperation, they turned to the same ancient remedy, digging up the dead, burning the heart, feeding the ashes to the living. They followed the grim blueprint etched into New England folklore, a ritual born of grief and terror. But Abigail's heart, when unearthed, was unlike myrrh. It pulsed faintly, warm and dark. The men recoiled, but the women, desperate mothers and sisters, clung to their faith in the old ways. The fire was lit, the heart was consumed, but the sickness persisted. One by one, the Johnsons succumbed, their bodies wasting, their souls fraying, until only the father remained, a man hollowed by sorrow and terror. Stories spread like wildfire. Families began guarding their dead, placing heavy stones over graves, driving stakes through corpses, and marking boundaries with crosses and holy water. Children were kept indoors after dusk. The wind carried stories of shadowy figures lurking just beyond the edge of the woods, of eyes gleaming in the dark, watching, waiting. The panic engulfed the region, twisting the fabric of daily life. Markets emptied by nightfall. Priests preached fire and brimstone sermons on the dangers of neighbors eyed one another with suspicion, for anyone could be harboring the undead. The graveyards became battlegrounds between the living and the dead, places of whispered curses and desperate rituals. Amidst this chaos, a young woman named Eliza Monroe emerged as an unlikely voice of reason. A healer and scholar, Eliza had traveled across Europe studying folklore and medicine. She understood the science behind the consumption of tuberculosis, but also the fear that gripped the hearts of her people. With compassion and fierce determination, she confronted the villagers, urging them to find balance between superstition and reason. She argued that burning the hearts was a desperate attempt to regain control in the face of helplessness, but warned That fear itself could become a far deadlier disease. Yet, even Eliza could not deny the shadows. She, too, had seen the unexplainable fields where the crops withered overnight, shadows that moved without bodies, and faces staring from the darkness with hollow eyes. She wondered if the line between the living and the dead had blurred forever in these haunted woods. The panic eventually faded, its fires dying down as modern medicine took root, and the old fears were buried beneath the progress of time. But the scars remained in the cracked stones of forgotten graves, in the lingering chill that descends on cold nights, and in the stories whispered by those who still remember. Because some things never truly die, they wait, and when you stare too long into the darkness, sometimes it stares back.